in the Design and Engineering School, and I'm very excited to moderate this panel. So we've all seen countless scooters and e-bikes all over dozens of American cities now, and these visions of the future of mobility that are very exciting. So we're here to talk about the promises of what this new regime of mobility is going to give us. And we're going to look at how the tech is evolving and how cities are evolving both in response and in preparation for some of these changes that are coming. So we're here to look at what's hindering mass adoption for micromobility and what needs to change in order for micromobility to reach its full potential. So I want to begin by introducing our four panelists. We have on the far end, we have Matt Warfield, who is a new mobility planner at the City of Boston Transportation Department. Tarani Duncan is a product strategist and advisor to the pioneering autonomous micromobility company Tortoise. Asaf Bitterman is the CEO and founder of Super Pedestrian, a local company here in Cambridge, and they are a robotics company building the next wave of intelligent and connected vehicles. And finally, we have Andrew Salzberg, the former head of transportation policy and research at Uber, and now is currently a Loeb Fellow here at Harvard. So we'll have Q&A later, so please start noodling on your questions. So let's begin asking questions for all the panelists about the potential for micromobility. Do you see micromobility moving a meaningful chunk of drivers out of their cars? Whoever would like to begin.
Yeah, I can start. So micromobility is a super interesting space. I think you all agree it's Sunday morning of the Super Bowl and you could be at home making chicken wings right now, but you're a nerd like I am. So you're here to hear about it. So what we're seeing is the largest historical shift from an ownership model to a service model, so mobility as a service. But we're also seeing some challenges with that. So 60% of trips are less than 5 miles, which is the sweet spot for a small electric vehicle. And what we saw in 2018 was this amazing explosion of trips taken on small electric modes, with 84 million trips, and more than half those being done on kick scooters. A kick scooter isn't necessarily designed for all jobs to be done less than 5 miles. And we also saw, this consumer good, big mass deployed across many different markets, not necessarily designed for the robust use that it saw. So I think where we are is really good proofs of concepts, and I'm excited to hear more about how Asaf is iterating on the form factor so that we can create vehicles for the job to be done.
I can talk a bit about in my former life as someone who worked at Uber in a bunch of capacities. I think one of the differences between micromobility and what was happening on the rideshare side. So in terms of when rideshare was starting, or ride hail, or choose your chosen term, back in when I worked there earlier, 2013, the idea was sort of put cars on the road with phones and then demand will follow. And in the US that kind of worked most everywhere. It was pretty straightforward. You didn't have to pick and choose where you were making an effort to deploy those kinds of vehicles. But if you look at the history, I think this sort of became obvious as Uber was more invested in, through Jump in micromobility, that it was sort of take the same approach. Let's put lots of bikes wherever it's possible to put lots of bikes through regulation. So put thousands of bikes in Dallas and Austin and everywhere you want. And what they started to see pretty quickly was, hey, ridership depends a lot on the shape of the city and the design of streets, which seems like a very obvious thing if you're in the bike world or scooter world or have come out of that community. But I think was kind of a bit of a revelation for companies that were sort of newer and were general technology companies. So one of the things that comes out of that, which is maybe obvious, but in a place like the US, pretty hindering, is that the adoption is very dependent on the ability to scoot safely to a lot of places in a relatively easy amount of time. Basically, urban design, I think, is a limiting factor. And you're seeing that with Uber having the benefit of being international as well as Lime, tons of energy in Europe, because the short-term potential for adoption is so much greater because it's easier to get around by bike and scooter, as it always has been, and what we would do with technology. So one of the things I think about a lot is, how do we change the physical fabric of cities to enable more of that adoption? That's a slow and difficult process, and in the US there aren't an enormous amount of places that are built to accommodate kind of smaller, lighter vehicles.
Yeah, maybe I'll add on to this. So other than Super Pedestrian, I have been one of the two founders of a lab called Sensible City Lab at MIT. And we've been around since 2003, looking at really the intersection between technology and the major problems cities experience. And most of the work was on transportation over the years. And, you know, it's not a new concept to have multimodality as a solution for minimizing what's called VMTs in jargon, vehicle miles traveled. And we just talked about it also over there in the other room. The problem was that while we got very good over the years at doing let's call it the mass transport part of the equation, the bus, the subway, the light rail, you know, not perfect, but pretty good, pretty well understood. And you know, it's very common to walk to the subway and then walk again in New York and London and many other places. And the question is, okay, well, that serves a certain portion of your trip demand. Can you serve a much larger portion of your trip demand with vehicles that can replace walking on either end of those trunk trips, and to serve people who live in the suburbs, cities which maybe don't have as dense of a subway deployment or no subways at all. Right? And with that in mind, we did a study in 2008 where we took Vodafone, AT&T, and two other companies that are asked not to be named, data about all their users, and through GPS and initially through cell tower location, and developed a much more granular, what's called origin destination matrix, to understand that point. So basically, where do people come from and where do they go to? And we did this for 850 million people. So a very large sample size over a year, US, parts of Asia, and big parts of Europe. And what we saw was very interesting, was that if you overlay this on a transport supply map, right? You got your origin, you got your destination, and then you see where you have supply, you realize that on either end you're missing, you know, in the city center, anywhere between 1 to 3 kilometers on average, and there's a lot of variation there, so I'm going to be oversimplifying, and about 5 kilometers on the sort of residential end, right? And these are consequences of planning that have been done, you know, planning decisions that have been done in the 50s. And if you're now trying to address that kind of demand, it's very clear what type of range and what type of vehicles you need to have, and also where you need to place them. At the moment, what we're doing with micromobility is because it's such a hard place to operate economically, right? It's very hard to make ends meet as it is today. You deploy where you can get demand, right? You just do, because otherwise you go belly up immediately. And which means that you're deploying this downtown to capture tourists, capture people who want to save a few minutes. But it's really replacing walking for the most part. That's the truth, and it's fine. It's a great way to start. But now if you want to offset this to something that could really replace a car trip, we need to start to think about this in the context of a longer trip, of those who really are required to use the car in order to get into, do whatever they need to do in the city and get out. And that means that, you know, in the medium term, cities will probably need to fund that part of the equation, meaning if you're now a transport operator and you need to move out to the suburbs to deploy your fleet, and you're going to see a third of your utilization, you're taking a big hit on revenue. Somebody's got to pay for this if you're doing this in the service of minimizing VAT. Now, there's a lot more to it, but the good news is that mayors, and I'm saying mayors, the city of, as a catchphrase for city officials, are not only getting this, they're at the forefront of it, right? So there are many places around the world where cities are getting it, and they're saying, I'm not interested in micromobility if it's only, you know, 0.8 kilometers median trip length. Not interested. It's a way for rich people to save a few minutes walking, right? I want this to be something that really has an impact on the city. So they don't want to kill it as it is, but they want to now start to work with these operators. It will take a long time, I bet, to shape it in to the planning strategies per city for its transportation, which makes sense.
Well, I'm also going to add something to what Saf was saying. Just you would imagine, given you were talking about the origin and destination matrix and how important that is, and mapping demand and seeing where trips are actually being taken, you would think that operators are able to operationalize this, that they have pretty robust demand management tools in-house. I think what actually we're seeing is that that is not the case, that this is actually a pretty big problem area that needs to be solved. So that's part of the advising work that I'm doing at Zoba right now, just spatial analytics and making sure that operators are able to provide a reliable service, because vehicles exist where they're needed then, and folks can actually rely on these scooters for more than just a serendipitous encounter. They can actually then start thinking about them as a tool when they're trip planning.
Yeah, and I would add, from the city of Boston perspective, we don't have a scooter share program right now, and I think one thing is we're thinking about a policy potential for that based on, depending upon the state law change, is that the design piece, and so this works in some areas, some cities it works in others. I think Boston is a very small footprint, it's a dense city. We have a robust public transportation system, we have a pretty robust public bike share system, and there's a lot of concern about the cannibalizing of that bike share system, of public transit, of taking away from people walking. So we're one of the largest walk modes in the country of any city. So I think there needs to be added benefit, and it's kind of hard to see that added benefit right now when we're talking about within the city, especially because the majority of our vehicle traffic is coming from outside the city, coming into the city. So there needs to be that connection at the end. Are we connecting to the commuter rail? Are we connecting to some other piece that's bringing people into the central core, not by car, but another mode? And I don't see folks riding a scooter all the way from Newton to downtown. That's not really a real
And are you able to work with the city in partnership to actually,
Yeah, we do. So we're right now, just particularly the e-scooter policy, we're working with Brookline, Cambridge, Somerville, and Watertown on a regional approach to it, but we haven't expanded out beyond that. But I know there's other conversations with the bike share.
yeah, because you're talking to the city where the trips originate from with a car.
Right.
So as micromobility is growing, it's important for operators to have positive relationships with the cities in terms of permitting process, as well as users are, as riders are using these vehicles to make sure that everything is as the city intends for it to work. So Matt, I know that you've worked for the city of Baltimore and helped launch an e-scooter pilot program there. Can you share with us what that entailed and maybe what problems it had down the line?
Sure, yeah. So Baltimore is a very different transportation landscape than the city of Boston. So there's a lot of differences there. But so in Baltimore, it's starving for transportation options. The public transportation is not necessarily reliable. It has a few. The metro goes east-west and kind of culminates downtown at Johns Hopkins. It's not really. It's kind of a getting in and getting out. Same thing with the light rail system. It's really getting from the airport to downtown to the stadiums, the football and baseball stadiums. Not necessarily designed for actually moving people through the city. So it was a place very car-centric, big wide roads. You can get from one side of the city to the next in 15 minutes. It's kind of a thing you can get anywhere in the city in 15 minutes in the car. But of course, there's this growing demand for other ways to get around, increased bicycle infrastructure, people wanting to bike. And leading up to the launch of the pilot program, there was a bike share system that was publicly owned but operated by a private operator. It wasn't doing well in the environment in Baltimore. So at the same time, we were kind of trying to figure out how to deal with that. Bird launched within the city, kind of giving us that drive to come up with a policy to manage micromobility. So at the same time, we were planning on shutting down our docked bike share system. We then ramped up the scooter share pilot, which really our biggest concern with that was addressing the need in the underserved communities that were being served by the bike share system. So it's very focused on equity, deployment in certain areas, and things around those. And it was a 6-month pilot. I left shortly towards the end of the 6-month pilot, and we created another program beyond that, made available more additional companies in the city, and it's been very successful, again, I think because there was such a demand for transportation options in the city.
So are operators doing enough to ensure a healthy future in terms of that relationship? In terms of, let's say micromobility does grow at the adoption rate that it has today, and there's only so much walking that it can cannibalize. So what does that relationship look like in terms of transit use? Does transit use go up? Does car ownership go down? What does that look like in a bit of a 3 to 4 year or even 5 year long term?
So I think thinking about the city of Boston, there's a lot of vehicles that are sitting unused. So we could think about, are we replacing vehicle trips in the city? So you have your car and you're driving internally in the city, that 3 to 4 mile range. We're probably going to be convincing people to get rid of their car through micromobility, just like as we're trying to do to expand access to car share vehicles and bike share stations. Our goal is a 10-minute walk from any bike share and car share station. I think you will convince people to get rid of their car, but not necessarily replace car trips in general. I think that impact within the city itself is going to be fairly low, but I think it will create opportunities to curb as we open up space within neighborhoods and other cities to do better things within just store vehicles.
Just comment on the general question of city relationships. I worked at Uber for a long time. I don't work there anymore, so obviously I've never seen any conflict between operators and cities. But I think one of the things that I think about in terms of the relationship and the future of it, I think maybe it doesn't seem related, but to me the best thing that's going to happen in terms of operator-city relationship going forward is what happened to WeWork, to me. I think what happened to WeWork is going to be a really good slowdown, potentially. We'll see if things pick back up. But I think the slowdown of kind of unlimited money to back money-losing operations for all of these operators, that going away or slowing down even, I think to me can be really helpful for the potential relationship between cities and operators. I think the main point of tension, both for Uber and for other operators, has been desire to grow really fast, and cities, very understandable reluctance to allow something to kind of grow at the scale that people would like it to without knowing what the consequences are. So I think if you take a little bit of the need for growth at all costs, and not just by one company, it's not actually up to Bird or Lime independently to decide what the marketplace is for. It's sort of the environment that they exist in. We have very abundant money, and top line growth being the only concern, I think is a real recipe for conflict with cities. And to the extent that is changing, and I think companies like Tortoise or others who are focused on helping people be profitable and manage the fleet more effectively, if that becomes the focus, I think just by that happening will help the city relationship, operator relationship a lot. And so I'm very optimistic in some ways about a change in tone when money is a little more rational, which may not actually happen. Who knows what the future holds? There's still a lot of money sloshing around globally looking for returns, but maybe we would take a little bit of a slowdown to that, and that could be, I think, a really big potential turning point for the relationship.
I think it's a very good point, actually. And maybe not just to slow down, growth at all costs, but also to make it very clear to the city that, if the city doesn't take this seriously, that opportunity might actually go away, right? So there needs to be sort of the embrace of the city, potentially even with funding in areas where you want to meet equity requirements or planning requirements, which I expect again to take time. But if you break down, what it takes to make an operation successful, right? From the big picture perspective, well, micromobility meaning having a positive impact on congestion and being sustainable as a business, it requires one, what we talked about earlier, right? The planning aspect, which I expect if this industry becomes let's say a staple, it will have to be worked into a bigger planning context, micromobility. The second one is the three aspects. That was the first one. The second one would be safety and compliance of vehicles, right? Vehicles need to be a lot safer. To date, are a lot of accidents that are generated because of failures in the vehicle. That's Super Pedestrian focuses on this in a major way with active safety systems in the vehicle. The third one would be sort of making the cost work, right? So how can you actually make it so that these vehicles can be utilized over much longer periods of time, and most importantly, operated with much fewer people. Today, you need an army of people to support these vehicles because they're just, they don't have any smarts in what's on the streets. But more specifically to your question, regarding integration with cities, I think there's something that we still haven't explored. You might know about what Salida Reynolds did in LA with the mobility data standard. There's been a lot of pushback with respect to data flow between the ride-hailing operators and the city. Right? They have this API to share data. But when it comes to micromobility, there's actually a big opportunity there. Right? I'll give you an example. With a fleet of scooters that we have released it last week in the first deployment, there is an API for the city to define its own rules and geofences, right? And I think we'll see more and more of this. Right? Why go through the operator in the first place if anyway and have this sort of enforcement battle, arms wrestling? Let the city call the rules by themselves. Where can you park? What should be the speed limit? And put the monkey on their back, right? Make the right decisions. It's if you're wrong, iterate on it, and we'll be transparent and share the data as needed, so you can actually enforce in real time.
Yeah, I want to hop in on that. So, two things happening with cities and micromobility operators. Micromobility's been a Trojan horse for conversations around how we allocate public space. And the second thing to what Scott was saying is it's also been a Trojan horse for conversations around ridership privacy and data collection. And so I think that what we're going to see with the future of operators and cities is this really strong partnership in the physical realm. So mobility hubs, dedicated bike lanes, protected bike lanes. But then there's on the digital frontier going to be contention moving forward. And that's because with MDS, the data feed is de-identified, but it's not anonymized. And there was a study that was done that showed trips between a high school in Austin, Texas and Planned Parenthood. And you could see like the individual trips happening. And so de-identified location data is actually still very much personal data. So I could find out where someone lives, who their romantic partners are, where they go to the doctor and things like that. So it's also a good opportunity to question, like, yes, cities should have insight into like the efficacy of these programs. Yes, they should have insight into who's complying with permit requirements and who isn't. But should they have access to this kind of data at this level? I think the answer is no, and I also think that mobility operators should not either. So that's something that is going to come up. And then the second piece, which is actually really interesting, LA DOT is just incredibly innovative. They have this consultant, John Ellis, who has a company called Lacuna AI. And what they're trying to do, I think, is control the routing graph, which is very interesting. So they're calling like Waze, Google, Apple Maps into these meetings, and what they're trying to say is, hey Waze, Apple, Google, can you exclude these public roadways from your routing graph so that we don't generate turn-by-turn navigation directions or routes that go through these areas? So I think what we're going to see is, and that creates these crazy network effects that can really have profound impacts on the road network. Is a pretty hairy problem space like we were talking about earlier with spatial analytics. Like that could have really profound implications on the routing network. So I think what we're going to see is like more partnership, stronger partnership in the physical realm, and then on the digital realm, more contention. And then something that I would be really interested in exploring further is, DDOT in DC, they will subsidize, their public bike share programs. Biketown in Portland has a third-party sponsorship with Nike. In a VC-funded world, there's kind of this like superfluous, our brand first approach that really challenges like the traditional funding models of shared mobility. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we do with funding models going forward, and also should transit operators just operate those systems? I think is a pretty good question.
And I think it's actually fascinating, this tension between how cities want this data, this MDS mobility data specification data, which, I mean, cars don't have this data, but with these shared mobility fleets, we actually have this new idea of having cities knowing what's happening on the streets.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the play too, right? Like once they get real-time data from smaller vehicles, that can then branch into other on-demand connected vehicles, and then pretty soon that city is controlling the entire routing graph, determining where you can be and when. So should cities have that power? I don't know, but it's going to be really wild to watch it unfold.
So watch MDS and see how many cities take it up, and how many cities, in fact, if it ever does get used and then gets shelved because of data privacy issues and concerns.
Yeah, I mean, just a caveat on this. The current implementation, while the idea is good, you don't need individual routes in order to make an interface of data work, right? It's not that, it's take it or leave it kind of suggestion. It's maybe it's a longer discussion that you don't want to have here, but I mean, there's so many things that you have to manage as a public good in a city when you have transportation as a service. The curb, right? The space on the road, our most prized shared real estate in the city, right? The capacity in each mode that's moving. All these things can be managed, right? Without necessarily identifying an individual and following him or her around.
So let's actually continue to talk about data and actually think about going up the chain a little bit. We have aggregators, which are taking data from multiple companies. So if you are a scooter or e-bike user in a city, you're going to have 6 apps on your phone. And so what is the role of consumer interfaces around those aggregators?
So I can take a stab at that. In full disclosure, I work as an advisor with Transit App, so some of you may know them, and they're an aggregator in the space. They're obviously focused on transit, hence the name, but have increasingly branched out to include other modes. And I think that's one example, but just one, frankly, of lots of other companies that are thinking about, can you combine different operators in one place? There's a lot of commercial concerns. I used to work at an operator Uber that maybe didn't love the idea of being aggregated by a higher level company, whatever that was. I think Lyft and others share the same, concern about that. There's a lot of general, tech strategy, even beyond mobility, It makes an argument that you want to be the place that you interact with the customer, no matter what business you're in. There's a lot of tension that people want to own the interface of lots of modes, no matter what company you are, whether you're an operator or an aggregator. You kind of want to be at that nexus between the customer and what they're requesting. I think there's a bit of tension in that business strategy and what we've talked about before, a lot of interconnectedness, right? How easy is it to get a transit journey on a commuter rail system and then combine that with not just specific operator, but every operator. I think it might run a little bit counter to the idea of, most efficiently using vehicles, right? If there's separate systems that kind of don't talk to each other, do you end up with a surplus potentially of vehicles, a lack of ability to connect multiple operators together in the same place? So I think there's a tension there. I think it's unresolved, and I think one of the things interesting about it is it has got probably a tiny, tiny fraction of the attention that the conversation around regulator data, which is what I think of as MDS, the piece about operator to consumer rather than operator regulator, I think has received almost no attention. I think Lyft and transit had a bit of a dust up around city bike payment access. There's been some conversation around something called scooter map, a little bit of kind of aggregation conversations, but very little. And that may, as we think about the future, may become more important. Maybe it gets less important potentially if all of this competition in the marketplace goes away and you sort of go back to there is one operator operating bikes or scooters, or the combination of the city or the transit agency is operating it, maybe it becomes less important. But if we think there's going to be a competitive market with multiple different modes working together, then I think that question of how do you integrate them and who integrates them and what terms becomes more interesting and more important, and maybe somewhere where public agencies think more aggressively about regulations. We have some of that stuff like GBFS, the bike feed specification. I think my understanding is that's sometimes relatively loosely enforced, doesn't include full details on things like payment. So to me, it's a big bundle of issues that people are only starting to pick at the edges of, so I think will become more important.
I'll add a small point, which is aggregation. You can think of it in the sort of narrower sense where it takes away the friction of having multiple wallets, for multiple operators on your phone, and you can just pick whatever is best for you. But I think that's the sort of the smaller, or let's say, less meaningful advantage you'll have if as we go toward aggregation. I think there's a long time before we'll see aggregation in the marketplace. Probably not until vehicles are really an online asset in a massive sense, right, with autonomy itself. But aggregation will really have an impact if the routing algorithms behind the aggregator are doing a lot better job than what today's routing algorithms do on the ride-hailing side and definitely on the taxi side. So if you can take into account, minimizing miles traveled, minimizing, travel time in your algorithm, and there are technologies today that actually enable this, right? And put that into the aggregator, now you're having a meaningful impact, both to improve utilization for an operator, right? Drive less, take more people, but especially, take less space on the road than
I think that, so mobility as a service has been such a buzzword in mobility tech for the last 3 or 4 years. Google in Portland just laid off 30 employees. They were a mobility as a service platform. I think it's because it's one of those things where we're not doing adequate customer discovery. We're too in our heads and in our technology, not into how our customers actually utilize transportation. So I'd say aggregation of mobility service and a platform is a nice thought, but if the vehicles aren't where you need them when you need them, it doesn't matter. So really, I think it's the success of these aggregators is less about are we digitally displaying all the service in one application, and more about are the right vehicles located in the right place at the right time, and ahead of that time, can I lay in my bed at night knowing that on the corner of Memorial and Magazine that I'm going to find the tool that I need for the job, in the same way that a bus stop would exist or a transit hub would exist. So I feel like mobility as a service and aggregators are a nice thought. I just want to walk somewhere and organically experience it. If you look at trip origins for these micromobility companies, a lot of it's just organic. It's not, they see it, and then they use it. They're not looking in the app ahead of time. So it's a good thought. I think that aggregation isn't helpful if you don't have operational excellence and you're not providing, you have to provide a reliable service for that to work.
Right.
I want to ask one more question before we get to about 10 minutes of Q&A. And I want to think about what does the future of the vehicle look like? There's a lot of changes that have happened since the first deployment two years ago with that Gen 1 scooter. And now we're already at Gen 3 on the streets. Gen 4 is being talked about. There's a lot of exciting things that are going on, but we're actually, between a couple of you actually have a unique history with onboard intelligence. So this is actually giving some cognitive ability to scooters and e-bikes. What does that imply, and what does that mean as an opportunity?
Well, if we look at the industry today, I argue there's no more Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3. It's all Gen 1. There's a lot of marketing fluff around it, but the vehicles, okay, they've been made mechanically a little bit better, like more robust, so they don't fall with the neck or they don't break in half. But these are technologies from the 70s, right? Just to extrude aluminum, size it properly for your load. And if we take 5 steps back, micromobility will have many different shapes and forms, right? Scooter for the 1 kilometer, an e-bike for the 2 to 5, a moped for the 5 to 10, a covered vehicle for when you need to schlep your kids and you're shopping, and any variation thereof depending on the country and the shape of the city. So, we're it's great that we're starting somewhere today. Scooter is probably the most simple one we'll ever see, the kick scooter, right? It's this connected to that, right? Seriously, right? And if you want to design it, it's a one horizontal extrusion and another diagonal extrusion, and they have to meet at the point with a strong enough joint. That's it. Right? It's very, very simple to do if you design it right. But even if you experience all the gains you can gain from mechanical improvements, it takes you only that far, right? Because at the end of the day, think about it in the abstract. When you own a vehicle, you make sure that you take care of it to a certain extent, right? If the brakes are not working, you're gonna take it to service, right? If it's not charged at night, you're gonna charge it. We have one set of eyeballs per vehicle for privately owned, say, kick scooter or e-bike. Once you deploy them in the streets, that equation is broken. It can't be. You can't have a person checking every scooter before every ride, right? You'll need as many caretakers as riders, so it doesn't scale up. At the same time, you have a much higher utilization of the asset, and it's left on the street, so it's getting more abused and less, taken care of. This means that the only way to address that problem is to automate, the taking care of the vehicle, and build technologies into the scooter or into whichever other mode it will be in, to replace people, so that you can operate a fleet of 1,000 vehicles instead of with 30 or 50 people per city, with 5 or 10, and have the service quality be a lot higher. The vehicle can ask itself before every ride, am I safe to ride? Are the battery cells all connected? Are all the components working? Am I in the right temperature range? Are the brakes working? All the basic stuff. If the vehicle can do that, and this is what our vehicles do, it's a self-advertisement. And I'll give a demo at 2-something o'clock today so you can see it for yourself. And many other things that are higher level intelligence that people can't do, right? Some things we can't see inside the vehicle. If we can do that, and I'm sure there will be many other companies that compete in that space, that's when we'll start to see much higher safety levels, much lower costs. And these are key, right? Compliance, safety, and then the business model. Right? Otherwise, we won't be able to make money on this, and these companies won't be able to survive in the long run.
Yeah, I have some thoughts here as well. It's super cool to hear what Super Pedestrian's working on. Field technicians and maintenance. So I think it's like a classic mistake in transportation, overcapitalization and lack of investment in maintaining what we've built. I think that we can see that through the $5 billion that we've invested into micromobility to date. And so it's really interesting to hear about sensors and telematics and maintenance data that you can grab from these vehicles remotely and see if you need to dispatch a technician. But I think the push even ahead of autonomy is generating return for the life cycle of a vehicle and all of its wear parts. And we're not seeing that right now. It should be that a vehicle earns revenue, and that it makes more revenue than it costs to maintain it, and that it lasts each wear part, which is just like a brake pad or a bell or a light. Anything like that is designed for ease of maintenance, and it lasts long enough to, when you do the cost benefit, well, even with maintenance, this vehicle made more in rides than it took to to initially buy it and maintain it. So I think that that's like a big problem area right now that I'm sure that you all are thinking about that too. And then also I would say that my concern with telematics and sensors is if you've had a car, you've had a dirty sensor before that triggered false errors. So that'll be really interesting to see how super pedestrian handles that.
No sensors.
No sensors? Okay. I wanna hear more.
Sensors are terrible.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So yeah, I think that we need to emphasize, like, if we are going to place vehicles in the field, we should be responsible for maintaining those vehicles and making those safe. And as compelling as autonomy can be and teleoperations can be, I feel like we have a lot more R&D to do just around the basics, which is creating a safe vehicle that can last a long time and is designed for ease of maintenance by trained employees.
But we talk about telematics. Telematics, I think, is too little too late. Okay, so I know that this thing's broken somewhere. The vehicle should be able to protect itself.
Preventive.
And prevent, in real time, see something happening, maybe even a little bit of prediction into the future. We're able today to do it in 5 nanoseconds. That's the farthest horizon we've been able to get. But it's enough to prevent a fire, right? So the basic stuff, and see something coming, prevent it from breaking the vehicle, and therefore prevent it from then damaging the rider. You do the brakes, there's a component that's failing. You can experience intermittent quality of service on the vehicle. You get confused. It's dangerous enough to ride next to cars, let alone to control something that's doing something unexpected, which happens more often than you believe, right? And then cost follows, right? If your vehicles fail, not 20% less, but 5% of the overall failures, all of a sudden your cost model is very different. You appreciate the vehicle on a much longer period.
Yeah, totally.
Great, I think we have time for at least one question from the audience. This gentleman right here.
Yeah, this is a question for Tarani about Tortoise. So my dream is that I can schedule a scooter to show up in front of my door, maybe any other form of transit, like Micromobility, to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning and I can ride to work and I can switch every day. That's the dream. And I think Tortoise is trying to deliver on that dream, but I'm a little highly skeptical that it's not just going to be another, it's an autonomous vehicle and it's going to be here in 2020, 2017, 2021, and it just never happens. So can you speak to a little bit of, can Tortoise deliver on the promise of autonomous rebalancing of fleets?
I would just say that's fair. What are you saying is fair? I think right now what Tortoise is in R&D mode, they're de-risking, and what we're looking at in the short term is, autonomy in areas that are safe for autonomy, and then teleoperations for the more difficult maneuvers. But starting off actually 100% teleoperations. So yeah, the goal is to be able to fetch a scooter like you could just call a puppy. But we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Okay. Additional questions? I think you answered this question earlier, but go ahead.
So, assuming micromobility isn't just for big cities like Boston, how do you explain the value proposition of, say, MDS or spatial analytics or even micromobility? So, it's up to a city like Needham using Wellesley, not just these massive cities that have, full-blown transportation departments.
When a service area becomes less dense with vehicles, vehicles mile, VMTs traveled by operations teams greater, which means that when you distribute vehicles around, every move really counts. So human beings are pretty amazing optimization machines up to like 10 stops. We can kind of like John Henry our way against computers. It takes us longer, but we still generate like provably optimal routes. Beyond even like 25 stops, you're generating as many solutions as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So I think what people aren't, like, hi Martin, astrophysicist right here. So I think what we aren't considering is just, it's not as simple as putting scooters in high demand areas and seeing what happens. What Zoba is working on is this beyond human intelligence problem to make sure that assets, every mile traveled counts, that every intervention between a rebalancer, which is the team that moves a scooter around, and a scooter has ROI. And there's really intense optimization modeling that needs to happen to make sure that scooters are where people need them when they need them, and that we're minimizing the amount of money we're spending servicing these vehicles. Like it's very much that this is so underinvested in that you could chase your tail and not even know it. So that's why spatial analytics is just so so important. It's beyond our understanding, and a lot of times the model will even recommend things that feel counterintuitive, because it's just such a hairy problem space.
But there's another element to this in addition, right? So if you think about the pitch to a city, it depends on the land use in the place in many ways, right? If you're on the outskirts of a metro area, then a lot of trips originate from your city, which creates a big demand on your road network, twice a day, morning and afternoon, right? Morning and evening. And that has many negative implications for a city, whether it's Newton or Quincy, or that doesn't matter. If you live in a place and you go to work in the center of Boston or the center of any metro area, then that place cares about minimizing vehicle miles traveled. Right? So if you can make a pitch there to connect to a transit network, right, to the what's called the trunk on the periphery, it makes sense. Now, there's another set of places which are let's call them smaller townships that are disconnected. There are more self-contained urban cores, small ones, and there, with micro vehicles, you could actually replace completely a car trip, going to the supermarket, taking your kids to kindergarten, getting cash from the ATM, going to work. All that stuff, there's a big portion of those trips that can be replaced with small vehicles, and again, easing the load on the road network. So it depends on the place, but the pitch is quite straightforward.
All right, well, in the interest of ending on time, please join me in thanking our panelists.